Welcome to the Mothers of Misfits podcast. Join me for conversations about how to advocate for our kids in a one-size-fits-all world. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Mothers of Misfits. We're joined by Debi Lewis today. She is the author of Kitchen Medicine: How I Fed My Daughter Out of Failure to Thrive. She's also written for the New York Times, Bon Appetit, Huffington Post, Romper, Wired, and more. And now she lives in the Chicago suburbs with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. Debi, thanks for coming on today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Well, we've been actually talking about food here and there in the podcast and the importance of food and diet and understanding how that impacts our kids' other diagnoses and behavior. So you really had some struggles with your daughter from the start. So can you kind of take us all the way back to that and really share with us, why did you write your book? What was going on with your daughter that prompted you to want to share your story with others?
Sure. Well, my daughter was born in what seemed like a relatively straightforward manner, a little small, but other than that, relatively nothing to raise your eyebrows at. But very quickly, we saw that there were things, especially when she started eating solid foods, that were challenging. She didn't seem to like anything that had any texture to it at all. She ate very, very little solid food. She much preferred to breastfeed. And there were things that were odd about it, pocketing food in her cheeks for hours on end and that kind of thing. And when she was a year old, we discovered along the way she'd had quite a few respiratory infections. And so they all landed her in the hospital, which is unusual for a baby. And most people know babies get colds. Usually they don't have to be hospitalized. And it turned out she had a congenital heart condition, a abnormality in the way that her aorta came up out of her heart that required what sounded to me like a very big deal surgery, but the surgeons assured me this was one of the easiest ones that they did. And we were also told that was sort of going to resolve the problem. Her esophagus had been compressed, and so we could just move on and she would suddenly grow and suddenly thrive. And that didn't happen. Rather than give away everything in my book, because I'd love for people to read it, I will say that the mystery of why my daughter could not seem to eat enough or quickly enough went on for nearly 9 years. Through all kinds of different specialists and ways of trying to address the issue. And what it turned out to be had absolutely nothing to do with what she was eating. But along the way, we tried everything: elimination diets, medications, strategies for, when you eat and how long before you sleep, and all kinds of things like that. And I think when parents are told that their children have failure to thrive, I will speak for myself, but also for a lot of moms I've talked to, that moms tend to hear that as failure to feed. That if your child is failing to thrive, it must be because you're not doing the right thing. You're not feeding them enough or the right kinds of things, or being persistent enough, or maybe you're being too persistent. And that's painful to hear as a parent, when all we want is for our children to thrive. The idea that they're not thriving, and I'll put that in scare quotes, is really, it's painful to hear. And so why I wrote the book was because it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault, and it isn't your fault, parents out there whose children are diagnosed with failure to thrive. It's a very vague diagnosis that should be the trigger for the medical system to do much more thorough investigation, not point the finger at mom and ask mom to give the child another protein shake. So this book is for those moms and dads and caregivers of all kinds.
And I feel for you because, as the front line of advocating for our kids, particularly when they're that little, and we're in many ways the only advocate for our kids, it is extremely frustrating when we don't feel listened to. and it makes us think we're crazy, right?
Right.
Maybe am I? What's wrong with? Am I seeing something that nobody else is seeing? Am I just being a panicky mom? And we go through these thoughts and question ourselves and self doubt, and it can be a really ugly, helpless, tough mental place. And I'm sure you had those ups and downs, but clearly pushed through on behalf of your daughter. So in your book, you talk about a lot of medical professionals who did not, at least from your perspective, seem to listen to you.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dive deeper into that. In that, what advice would you give to parents who feel like they're in that same position where it's like they keep saying it and saying it and saying it, and no one's really hearing them?
Yeah. Well, I think, there's this saying that if what you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And
Right,
I
right.
think for doctors, that's true once you
Mhm.
get into sort of pediatric specialty medicine. If you are a doctor that focuses on the gut, then you are
Mhm.
going to look at problems that have to do with the gut, and you're not necessarily looking at what is touching the gut, what else is involved, what other bodily systems has this child had challenges with. So the one thing that I wish I could have done, and I would
Mhm.
recommend other parents try, is to connect the specialists with each other, to ask in a really pointed way, and in a way that doesn't give the doctor an opportunity to give up on it, to say, this is something that happened to my child when they were younger. Is there any connection? Could there be any connection? Would you be
Mhm.
willing to chat with this other doctor? That's one thing. I think coordination of care is not something that's built into our medical
Mhm.
system here.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of team meetings when it comes to a kid who's not actively hospitalized, right? So,
Mhm.
so I think that's one thing. But the other is, if something says to your gut, this isn't right, this person isn't listening, go to someone else. I know that that is a very privileged thing for me to say because I had time and I have
Mhm.
resources. And so I recognize that being able to do that is something that comes with a lot of privilege. But if it's possible for you to take another stab at it with a different doctor, it's exhausting to keep doing
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it's really important. And then the third thing I would say is to ask questions that force the doctor to think past the kind of cookie cutter response they give to everyone. So I'll give a really simple example. If a doctor says, well, your kid's got has stuffy nose for a couple weeks now. I think I'll just, do a round of antibiotics. Let's see if that kills it off. One of the things you could ask is why would you suggest antibiotics at this point? What are you worried might happen if we don't? And I'm not anti
Mm.
antibiotics. I think there's,
Mhm.
when
Mhm.
you have a bacterial infection, you usually need antibiotics. But
Mhm.
so that's just an example. But the question of what are you worried might happen if we don't do this is really important, because sometimes doctors are living also in a flawed system where they're left with very little time with each patient, not because they
Mhm.
don't want to spend more time, but because insurance companies give them 15 minutes and practices are busy and etc. So if you can say, what would happen if we don't? What are you worried about? Or if this was your child, what would you
Mhm.
do? I've asked that question of a lot of doctors. If this was your child, what would you do? And you'd think they'd give you the answer that they'd give themselves also, but sometimes that gives a doctor pause to think harder and to
Mhm.
take a step back. So those are three things I would recommend.
I love those questions. They're simple to ask, but powerful. And I can sense how they would shift the conversation, particularly
Mm-hmm.
the what would you do if this was your child?
Right.
I'm a big fan of looking at things holistically,
Mm-hmm.
connectedly. And you're
Mm-hmm.
so right. Our medical system is really built in silos. And
Right.
unless or until we as parents bring that together and create more of that team, uh,
Mm-hmm.
it, it's easy to not ever get those different parts of the puzzle speaking to each other. You
Right.
actually considered suing one of the doctors who had misdiagnosed your daughter.
Yeah.
Did you pursue that?
No. No, I didn't. And once again, the reason I didn't comes from a place of real privilege, because
Mm.
in the end, the whatever financial settlement might have come from that would really not have made a meaningful difference in my daughter's or our lives. She didn't, and most importantly, she did not end up with lasting, expensive complications from what happened.
Mhm.
So we didn't need money for her care. And we were always going to be able to pay for her to go to college. So that comes
Mm.
from, all kinds of privilege. So partly the answer was, is money going to make me feel whole? Is money going to make her feel whole?
Mm.
And the answer was
Mhm.
no. And also, I knew that often with a legal settlement, there's a gag order. There's a requirement that you not speak out about these things.
Mhm.
In the
Mhm.
case of the diagnosis that Sammy was given erroneously, eosinophilic esophagitis, I wanted a protocol change in how patients are diagnosed with this, and the protocol change could have saved us years
Mhm.
years of
Mm.
endoscopies, elimination diets, medications. And I want parents of children diagnosed with this to ask for this simple test. And it's a pretty much a yes or no answer. And
Mm.
so if this test comes up with no compression on a child's esophagus, then you can feel reassured that the diagnosis is correct. So it doesn't slow down treatment, but it
Mhm.
could stop unnecessary treatment. So what I wanted most was to be able to talk about it.
Mhm.
And I'm a writer. I studied writing in undergraduate and graduate school, and I processed my feelings through writing, and I wanted to write about it. So pursuing legal action, I worried would keep me from being able to do that. And I think we're quite litigious in general, and in
Mhm.
ways that maybe perpetuate this system of feeling like the only way you can get a closure or an answer is to sue someone. And if we take a break and stop suing people, maybe doctors will feel
Mhm.
more free to talk about the things they'd
Mhm.
like to do differently.
Yeah, and it might put them less in that defensive position, or I'm going to give antibiotics because of what could happen or the worst case
Mm-hmm.
scenario, whereas it may not be necessary right now in the process, right? A
Mm-hmm.
lot of their role, and I don't, envy them for this, is just to
No.
prevent all the worst case scenarios and be in a
Mm-hmm.
constant risk mitigative position.
Right.
And in some ways, sometimes maybe go overboard, if you will, in that caution and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
even in treatment so as to prevent the worst. But I'm curious to know if you lived with this erroneous diagnosis for years,
Mm-hmm.
what made you get to the point of saying, okay, this is not right? Or was it another doctor who said, we've been going down the wrong road? How did you realize, ooh, we need to get a better diagnosis, the right diagnosis?
So it's a complicated answer, but the
Okay.
truth is that the particular disease, this eosinophilic esophagitis, which is
Mm-hmm.
an autoimmune disease and results in an eczema-like rash on the inside of the esophagus,
Mm,
which can be
mm.
measured in a lab with cells under the
Okay.
microscope. It's a disease that it can only be diagnosed in remission or not in remission via endoscopy and biopsy, right? So we had a period of time when my daughter was actively sick, struggling to swallow, gagging all the time. And I thought for sure her next endoscopy would uncover, recurrence of this disease in her esophagus, but it didn't. She was very, very symptomatic
Oh.
and totally in remission from this disease. And it was only at that point that a doctor on the phone suggested that there might be a problem with the way her esophagus moved. And I was able to say, yes, there is, based on the congenital heart condition that she had. And his response is the sort of climax of the book. So I don't want to give it away too much, but
Oh, these
his
are so
res-
many
yeah,
teasers,
I
Debbie.
know I
Okay.
hate to do it, but I'd love for people to read the book.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have heard people describe it as a medical mystery and a real page turner, and so I'd love to keep
Mm.
people reading. But
Okay.
it was something that the doctor said that propelled us to into a new direction, that led
Mm.
to a surgery that changed her life forever for the better.
Wow. So
Mm-hmm.
your daughter's school,
Mm-hmm.
how did they support your family during this process? I cannot imagine lunchtime.
It was hard, but I will say that the American public school system has
Mm-hmm.
something in place called a 504 plan that you
Mm-hmm.
can do in any public school. And the 504 plan
Mm-hmm.
is different from an IEP. It's not about learning. It's about
Mm.
physical health issues and conditions. So
Mhm.
we had a 504 plan for Sammy during the elimination diet that stipulated, and we were able to meet with the school before the school year started. It was during her kindergarten year, which was
Mm.
awful way to start the school year, but they were really lovely about it.
Oh,
We made
good.
sure that the rules were, there were only really a few things because if they were followed, then there would be no issues. One was that she was not allowed to eat anything that didn't come from home.
Mm.
So, class snacks and all that kind of stuff. She just had her own little bin of things.
Mhm.
We had to take all the Play-Doh out of the classroom because Play-Doh is made with wheat. And so
Oh.
we provided modeling clay as an alternative.
Mhm.
So that was one of the things. And then the third thing was we asked for 2 days notice for class treats so that we could provide a similar alternative. And the school was generally very good about that. The school administration was lovely about it. The individual teachers were a little hit and miss. There were a couple of teachers who offered her foods that they shouldn't have, but
Oh.
thankfully she was smart. She was able to say no. She remembered the rule, um,
Mhm.
and um, and I was able to try to make it up to her later for the cookie that she was offered or the popsicle that she was offered. Um, so
Yeah.
those things were really great. And then we had a couple of very, very dear friends, one of whom had a kid in my daughter's classroom who, when it was their turn for snack, brought things that Sammy could enjoy with the kids, things like
Oh, how
whole
kind.
clementines, whole bananas, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, which
So
is
that
good
worked out well.
anyway. I would love that for snack. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
exactly.
So let's talk about Sammy and how did
Hmm.
she feel through all of this? It sounds like she didn't know any different, but I'm sure once she
Hmm.
got into school, especially, she realized that she was different. She was a misfit. And
Yeah.
I know it's hard to say, no, you can't have the cookies that the other kids are eating or the
Hmm.
cupcakes or, how did you keep her mentally healthy in general? And then I'm also
Hmm.
really curious, how did you keep her having a healthy relationship with food through all of this?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question, right? So
Mhm.
I will say Sammy's always had a taste in food that is unlike a lot of other little kids.
Mhm.
Her favorite food was always fruit from the moment that she started eating solid foods. And
Mhm.
so because fruit was never off the table ever throughout any of these diets that she was on, she always had the things she liked the most. And that is
Mm.
just dumb luck, she
Mhm.
wasn't, and the other thing would be that the things that were hard for her to swallow comfortably were things like cookies and cupcakes and cakes and
Oh, so that
things.
worked in your favor.
So it really did. She didn't
Yeah.
like those things very much.
Oh.
And so the only things that were hard were parties and gatherings and stuff. And I worked really hard to make sure that we had alternatives for her. I think the lucky thing is that when they're very little, like you said, they don't know any different. And she
Mhm.
didn't know any different. And for better or for worse, especially on a 6 foot elimination diet, one of the things that is easiest to give kids are things that are actually mostly chemical, which is,
Mhm.
not would not have been my first choice. But for example, Betty Crocker fruit snacks, totally safe on an elimination diet. And so, because they're mostly artificial flavors,
Mhm.
glucose and sugar, right? Those are fine.
Mhm.
And so, the fact that she could have fruit snacks, which is something I'd never had in my house before then, was such a treat that it worked out fine. But to your second question about how we made it um, possible for her to leave this experience with a healthy relationship with food,
Mhm.
we did not use terms like bad food, forbidden food, no food. What we used was safe and not safe.
Mm.
And that was because of the way her esophagus was built. And so we were able to frame it not that this is a bad food, but this food isn't safe for you right now. Or, this is, and we also framed the elimination diet as a science experiment. We're going to try each of these foods. We took
Ah.
them all out to begin with and then added one at a time. We said, first, now we're going to try eggs and we're going to do an experiment and see if your esophagus
Mm.
likes eggs. And so we took all the moral value out of food entirely. And I think that's important regardless of whether or not your kid is struggling with food. This idea that some foods are good and some foods are bad, and unless you have an allergy or a condition like what Sammy was diagnosed with, food is neutral. it's food, it's fuel. And, having a healthy relationship with food as an entity to me was much more important than whether or not my daughter liked kale, you know? And
You're
so
right.
yeah, I think that parents can get very over attentive to how many grams of trans fats and how much genetically modified blah, blah, blahs in their children's food. And of course, we want our kids to eat healthy foods, but I have written with great affection about both Brussels sprouts and Oreos. They're both delicious, and we're both
Amen
pretty
to
much
that.
equally excited about eating both of them.
Yeah. So, where can everybody get their hands on your book?
Oh, absolutely. Anywhere. You can order my book from anywhere you like to order books. If you have a
Okay.
local independent bookstore, I'd love for you to support them. If that's not for you, you can order it on Amazon or
Mhm.
bookshop.org or Barnes and Noble. It is available wherever you'd like to order books.
Okay. And we can also get in touch with you at debilewis.com
Yep.
and at Twitter on Grow the Sunshine. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we're all going to connect with you there. We'll also be sure to connect with your book in our Episode Insiders newsletter, which everybody can sign
Wonderful.
up for at mothersofmisfits.com. Debi, thank you so much for sharing your journey, emboldening us as parents and advocates for our kids,
Yeah.
and teasing us. Now I think we all need to know, how this mystery turns out exactly. At least we all know there's a happy ending. So thanks again.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Mothers of Misfits podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We also invite you to visit us at mothersofmisfits.com.